It's time for our children to leave for Children's Church. And we're going to explore another one of those questions that Jesus asked that cause us to look inside our very souls. One of my favorite Broadway musicals is Wicked. I've seen it twice. And I love it not only because of the extraordinary music, because of the message. If you're familiar with the plot of that story, it's based on the characters from The Wizard of Oz. Now, when Frank Baum wrote Wizard of Oz back in the 1930s, people were pretty clear about who was good and who was evil. Let's have some cheers for Glinda the Good Witch. And how about the Wicked Witch of the yeah, we know who's good and evil. But in Wicked, it gets a little harder to tell. Yeah, so it turns out that Elphaba, that's the name of this Wicked Witch of the West, is actually a mistreated young woman who's been bullied her entire life because of her skin color. And we know from Wizard of Oz what color her skin is, right? It's green. Yeah. And Glinda the Good Witch is a bit of a goody two-shoes. You know when you go to the state fair and you just keep eating that cotton candy? And by the time you get halfway through it, you're kind of sick of sugar? That's how I felt when I watched Glinda the Good Witch. She's just a little bit too good for her own good. Yeah. A little shallow. And so the whole story is about how these two young women become roommates and then friends, and by the end of this story, they're telling one another, because I knew you, I've been changed for good. Well, 2,000 years before Gregory Maguire came up with the concept of Wicked, there was an itinerant preacher in the land of Palestine who was preaching a similar message. Jesus had something to say about maybe the line between good and evil is not as easy as one might think. Can we look at this scripture here in this story? He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. Two men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, and even like this tax collector standing next to me. I fast twice a week, I give tithes of all that I can get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Oops. We're not really sure. In this day, the Pharisees don't think about what we think. Chad mentioned this the other week. Don't think about hypocrisy. Think about good church-going people, all right? Who've worked really hard to try to cultivate a righteousness, a goodness according to what Moses commanded. Yeah. And the tax collectors, we would hiss and boo them because they were in league with the Romans to extort money from us. Should be pretty clear who's good and who's evil in that scenario, and Jesus just had a way, right, of just setting the conventions, whether they're social conventions or religious conventions, and just setting it all on its head and saying, I think we need to look again about what real righteousness looks like. I had an experience one time. I was at a retreat in upstate New York, and a gentleman walked into the meeting hall, and he literally glowed in the dark. His holiness just emanated from him. I thought it was as if I felt viscerally the light in his life. And so I sidled up to him thinking that maybe some of it would rub off on me. And so we got put in the same small group. And he began to share his story, and it turned out he had a brother that was incarcerated for committing a terrible crime. And this man just began to speak of his brother with such disgust and such disdain. And I said, oh my gosh, what happened to your beautiful light? Did you forget the part about compassion? I wanted to say, 1 Corinthians 13, you can give your life for the poor and do all these kind of things, and you don't have love? Kind of nothing. Yeah, this is what Jesus is talking about here. Maybe not all of us are, maybe sometimes, I think I learned from that lesson, sometimes some of us are breathing in a little bit too much of the oxygen and not leaving enough for the rest of us. We're there's a meal out at the table, and we're like going in and gobbling up all the righteousness that's been served at the table, and our poor brothers and sisters don't have any left for them. Yeah, I began to see that. And I began to see that in my own life as well, how sometimes maybe the reason why someone else can't be good enough is because some of us have a need to be too good. So I'd like for us to look at this question now that Jesus asked, because he takes this story and now he puts it into the form of a teaching. This is from the Sermon on the Mount. Judge not that you be not judged, for with the judgment you pronounce you will be judged, and with the measure you use it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own? Can we just say that together? Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? And how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when there is the log in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Well, I was trying to think of an illustration about what this looks like in our world today. So I'm going to go out on a limb here, all right? I'm going to confess to you that, and you're going to be surprised for this, is anyone surprised? Usually when there's a social or issue, I kind of know where I stand on it. Have you ever noticed that about me? I kind of feel like I know what's right and wrong in my own mind. There's one issue I am torn, as if I'm being ripped apart. When I hear this issue about abortion, I see the holes in both sides, and I see the good in both sides, and I'm just torn, and I have to come down on one side or the other when I'm talking about it, and I made that choice, but I am so aware of the moral ambiguity of this issue. But there's one thing I'm really clear about. I am clear that if you're going to ride in on a white horse and change the laws so that any time that there is an egg that's fertilized, it is intended for it to come all the way to life and become a child. Doesn't it make sense that you'd take care of that child once it was born? If you're going to say that you came in and you were Glinda the Good Witch, and you saw this terrible evil, and you moved mountains to get the Supreme Court to reverse that decision, and you did that all in the name of God, doesn't it make sense that God might have in his will to look at the children who were actually born? Then can you explain to me, friends, while the state of Texas that led this fight ranks 41st among all of the 50 states of the Union about overall child well-being? Can you explain to me why the state of Texas is 42nd nationally on the amount of money they spend per student on education? Can you explain to me why Texas is ranked 46th and how well we provide food security for children? Can you explain to me why in 2019 the same state legislature who led this fight cut funding for early intervention for children with disabilities? You're looking at a mama who gets up every morning and deals with a child who has been traumatized by the abuse she experienced in the foster care system of the state of Texas, and how she was abused as badly in the foster care system than she was in the home that she was removed from. CPS is broken. And if you can move mountains to get the Supreme Court mobilized to change something in the name of the will of God, by the will of God, couldn't you figure out how to at least look at that system and make some changes in it? That's what I'm clear about. And you say to me, Margaret, you're looking at calling this bald-faced hypocrisy. How are you qualified to do that? And I'm going to tell you, because that's my story. I didn't get saved out of John 3:16. I got saved out of this from the Sermon on the Mount. You see, I was raised in a religious tradition that had to be Glinda the Good Witch. And in order to uphold their image of themselves as being the best Christians, the ones who were following Jesus the most, they had to set up criteria for righteousness. So there were 3 things in our church that if you could not do these 3 things, you were following Jesus better than anybody else. You couldn't drink, you couldn't smoke, and this 3rd one's really important, friends. Listen to this. Well, this is the most important thing. You could not dance. I'm not making this up. I wish I were. I was systematically trained in that religious system to make sure that I loved people, but not before I had thoroughly judged them. I know all about hypocrisy. My life story has been trying to get my brain reoriented towards what the gospel really says about what's important and what makes people good. This is my story. Not being able in the past to get in touch with my own dark side, I did a lot of really foolish things that harmed other people. It takes one to know one, and I'm still a recovering evangelical. So, what has helped me to get over this and to reprogram my brain to be more in keeping with what I know Jesus really intended for us to be, a people of love, is to stop striving to be a good little girl and to get in touch with my identity of being God's little girl. It's our identity that he says gives us the power to become the children of God. We don't have to put a mask on and pretend that we're better than we are. So here's what the funny thing is about my church. It was okay to go to movies as long as it was a nice, wholesome one, and so I went to the movie theater and saw Pinocchio. It gave me a counter-narrative, a counter-story to what I was learning at church. What does Pinocchio want to be more than anything else in the world? A real little boy. Yeah. When I get down on my knees, when I know that I've blown it that day, that I was Glinda the Good Witch, I pray, God, please make me real. I'm not a real human being yet, am I? I'm still a puppet. I'm still a marionette. I'm still made of wood. I want you to know that when you come to Kingwood Christian Church, I want you to know that if you've been labeled the Wicked Witch of the West for any reason, this is a place where you can come and people are going to say, I'm sorry that you experienced that, because actually you are a child of God. And I want you to also know that while we hope that you are a good person and we'll support you on your journey, that if you feel like to do that, you have to be phony, and Jesus was good, right, about picking out who was phony and who was real? Yeah. I want you to know there's something more important to us than your behavior. More than we want you to be a good person, we want you to be spiritually alive.